Okay, I hope you have a Bible with you. And if you read Greek, you're welcome to open a Greek New Testament to the letter of the Philippians. We're going to now begin our kind of very deep structured look at this letter to see what's going on. And before I begin, I want to say this. What struck me about this letter this last winter, early on in the winter, was that Paul's in prison. Evidently, the Philippians, as a congregation, are having to deal with authorities, probably Roman authorities. We'll come to that. And in other words, Paul and his fellow Christians in Philippi are having to live with empire. Now, I know that not everybody here is from the United States. I get that. But at one time or another, we've all had to learn to live with empire. And so the question that I asked myself when I began reading this letter was, how does Paul deal with living under empire oppression? Because he's been arrested and he's innocent of a, what we would call a crime. We're aware of that. He's been preaching the gospel and he's arrested. Now, we don't know why he's under arrest in Philippi. We're not even sure where he's under arrest at, although, as I said earlier, we're going to go with Corinth in the mid 50s, mid to late 50s, 50, I'm sorry, mid to late 52. Um, and we're going to see that, particularly today, Paul is writing from Corinth to Philippi, but he's also writing from Corinth. He'll write from Corinth to Galatia. Now, Doug Campbell has this fascinating thing called the neighbor hearer, the neighbor addressee. He uses this long German word for it. I guess the Germans figured it out first. But let's say Paul's in Corinth and he's writing these letters. The Corinthian church is going to be aware of these letters that he's writing. He may even read them to these congregations. We don't know. But it's almost as though the problems at Corinth are looking over his shoulder when he's writing Philippians and Galatians. And this makes sense. Paul's dealing with opponents that are really quite happy to see him in prison. And Paul's having to spin this around in such a way as to say that no, what has happened to me is not because I'm a bad person. What has happened to me is because the gospel is being preached and thus empires reacting against him. Paul's going to say that to the Philippians in so many words. So let's begin this letter. Paul and Timothy, servants or slaves of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, along with the overseers or guardians and deacons. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. These are the first two verses. Notice Paul doesn't call himself an apostle in this letter. He has no need to defend his apostleship to this congregation. And as he'll say down in verses 10 through 12, or no, I'm sorry, a little bit later than that, that they're not intimidated by these opponents that are coming at them. And so they have not given up on Paul's apostleship like had happened at Corinth, where perhaps the Peter group or perhaps a more zealous group from Jerusalem had come and had created problems for Paul as an apostle. That is, there was evidently talk that Paul wasn't a true apostle. The true apostles were from Jerusalem. The true apostles had been with John the Baptist. The true apostles were the Galileans. These were the true apostles, and Paul was not one of that group. Paul has to assert his apostolic authority at both Corinth and in Galatia. In Galatia, he comes right out and says, not only am I an apostle, but I saw the risen Lord, bam, right there in chapter 1. Jesus, the Father, was pleased to apocalypse his Son, reveal his Son to me. he says. Jesus and Paul came face to face, the risen Christ and the Apostle Paul. But to the Philippian church, he doesn't need to do this. This is a congregation that is extremely supportive of him, very supportive. In fact, they are Paul's biggest supporters. The Philippian church would have been his rock. Absolutely. Okay. He calls himself and Timothy douloi, servants or slaves. Again, not only does he omit reference to apostleship here, but he does something else he doesn't do except one other letter. He calls himself right off the bat a doulos, a servant or a slave. That is, someone whose life belongs to someone else, someone for whom there is no freedom of choice. There is only serving, only servitude in this. Now, don't think that Paul for a moment thinks that his service in the gospel and his service to the Lord Jesus is something he takes for granted or that he's resentful of. Quite the opposite. The Apostle Paul has a very, very powerful and unique view of not only his service to the Lord, but how his sufferings, his imprisonments, his beatings, how these all advance the gospel, that is, the gospel of the crucified, suffering God. And so Paul sees his own apostolic ministry as trotting in the same footsteps as Jesus. That is, for the apostle as for the master, the road to salvation, as it were, leads through suffering. So he calls himself and Timothy servants. You can translate this as slaves. You can translate it as bond servants. It just depends on the nuance you want to give it. I think here he's already going to begin a lot of the playing with words that he's going to do with reference to his imprisonment. So we're going to see some interesting use of military language. Remember, he's under military guard. We're going to see some interesting use of prison language. We're just going to see some interesting use of language related to servitude in this letter. Paul's already placing himself rhetorically right at the very, very front of the letter as one who does not own one's life. He's completely owned by another. And in this case, that's Jesus. And he sees himself and Timothy as having been bought, as it were, by the Master Jesus, and that's why they serve him. And this letter written by these servants then is to all the saints, the hagioi, the holy ones. That's a common standard Pauline way of referring to the church. It would come from the Septuagint. It would be a phrase used of the Jewish people, the saints, the holy ones. But now these holy ones are in Christ Jesus, and they dwell at Philippi, and they dwell there with overseers and or guardians and deacons. Now the Greek word episkopoi, we can think of episcopal, okay, is sometimes translated as overseer and sometimes just translated as bishop. This is incorrect. The overseers plural and the deacons plural are those who serve the community in very, very specific roles. What are those roles? Okay, now let me just say this. At the end of at the end of the 19th century in England, there was massive, massive controversy in and around leadership roles in the church, whether the church was to be considered made up of presbyters, that is, old men, or officially functioning dignitaries, that is, bishops and deacons. Okay. And you have your congregationalist type polity over here with the Presbyterians, and you have your monarchical type polity over here with your bishops and deacons and priests in the Anglican Communion. Big debate ensues at the end of the 19th century as to what these words mean and the history of their words. Now, I want to say this straight up front. There is no such thing as a model of the early church. There were many models. There were pluralities of models. You had the Jerusalem community, which becomes a caliphate. Now, if you know, a caliphate is where the leadership line is passed down through a family system. And so, while Peter begins as the evident leader of the Jerusalem church in the book of Acts, it quickly becomes a caliphate with James, Jesus' younger brother, the oldest of the younger brothers, taking over the leadership. And from that point on, the leadership of Jerusalem Christianity is a caliphate going all the way into the 160s and 170s, when great, great, great descendants of the family of Joseph and Mary are questioned by the authorities as to whether or not they are, these leaders in this caliphate. So already the Jerusalem church wants to turn the Jerusalem church over to the family of Jesus to run it. That's the way it's going to be. And Jerusalem Christianity was, even after they left at the time of the war, in and around 70 CE, that family would disperse back to Galilee, and that's where those Galileans, 5, 6 generations later, are discovered by the authorities. So that's one model. Okay. We know that model didn't work right off the bat, because already by chapter 6 of the book of Acts, already within 18 months of Pentecost, Pentecost would be in May of 33, the resurrection in April, Pentecost in May, and it's in 34, October of 34, that Paul's converted. But within that time, the Jerusalem church only is willing to take care of the Aramaic speaking widows. The Greek speaking Jewish Christian widows that would have attended the synagogue of the freedmen, or a Hellenistic synagogue, and not necessarily the Aramaic speaking congregations or the Aramaic speaking synagogues, they were left out of the care for the poor and the widow. Only that small group of Aramaic speakers, widows, were taken care of. This is why it's silly to say the early church was communist and everybody took care of everybody. That's bullshit right off the bat. Okay, it's historically inaccurate. There may have been some sort of attempt at some sort of communism, but it failed, utterly failed right away. I mean, the Ananias and Sapphira story should at least tell us that. And the subsequent chapter with Acts chapter 6 should tell us even more in the division between the Hebrews and the Hellenists there in the book of Acts. So then you have the Corinthian model. The Corinthian model of church leadership is apparently very, very charismatically oriented to the gifts. Okay? Then you have churches being addressed here like this, with overseers and guardians. And of course, in the later Pseudo-Paulines, they become official bishops. That title has already now become locked in. And the letters of Ignatius of Antioch are probably written around the same time as the pastorals. And that office is already very, very central to the early Christian community. I'm reasonably certain in my own work that prior to 70 CE, we had multiple models of congregational life and leadership being explored. But after the destruction of the temple, Christianity is quickly going to come under the authority of an apostolic figure or successor. Okay, so somebody in Rome is going to succeed Peter the Apostle, who is the alleged first pope. And of course, we know who that is. That's Pope Clement. And Clement writes the first epistle of Clement. And we have that, and so, and there's this line of succession now that'll begin to take place in the early church in all the major episcopal sees, SEES, the sees, the diocese, the parishes where there is a Christian community. There are going to be multiple house churches in these communities, and it's the bishop's job then to oversee congregational cohesion, because these house churches are constantly being visited by Christian prophets and others who are coming through. And they were very, very hospitable. And in fact, the early church has to deals with this as a problem, not only because of false teachers that come through, but also because some people outstayed their welcomes and were just grubbing off the church. Well, when Paul writes to the Philippians, these episkopoi and these diakonoi are not a hard and fast um, leadership that's going to be in every Pauline congregation, but this is a Roman colony. Philippi, remember, gets established as a Roman colony. It's under Roman administration. It makes sense then that a congregation like this is going to have a Roman type of leadership model, a hierarchical top-down governance model. It makes sense. That's not necessarily the case in Corinth. Okay? Now, when he writes to these leaders, he gives them a standard letter greeting: grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. That is Pauline. You're going to find it in every letter except for Galatians. In Galatians, Paul is so angry that he immediately jumps into dealing with the issues. In fact, there's no typical Hellenistic thanksgiving at the beginning of the letter. A normal Hellenistic letter is going to be, hey, it's me, Paul, to you, and I'm really happy and grace and peace to you. And, I pray for you and I think about you and I think kind things about you and you're wonderful and I praise you and thank you. Now, hey, Dad, can you send me some money? Then come the requests, right? Okay. But you have that thanksgiving there up front. Paul has that here in this letter, okay? And he is going to express his Eucharistia after he offers them charis. Now, charis, grace, Eucharistia, gratitude, Eucharist, and chara, joy, all come from that same root, the char root, chi alpha rho, charis, Eucharistia, and chara. So we want to watch as Paul shows how the grace of God evokes his own gratitude and joy for the Philippians. And he begins right off the bat and he says in his prayer, I give thanks to my God every time I think about you, on every remembrance of you. Every time you come to my mind, Paul says, I am thankful to God for you. Always, in every petition of mine on your behalf, with joy making the petition. The word petition is repeated twice here. It's emphasized, by the way, it's not just a request. The word request could be used. He doesn't just use the regular word request. He uses a legal term here, deesis, and it's like a petition that one takes to a court, okay? A petition of one's innocence or a petition of one's grief against a particular defendant. It's a petition. So already, Paul is stating the one to whom he takes official petitions. Think about this for just a moment, friends, especially if a letter like this happens to be read by Roman authorities or Roman authorities discover something like this. Paul is making it clear that for him, his petitions go to the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the one to whom he sends his petitions, his official requests, as it were. And what exactly is he thankful about with them? In verse 5, epite koinonia, in your, and we would translate the word koinonia as fellowship, but it's more than just the kind of friendship that one experiences in a congregation. Koinonia, deriving from koinos, the common good. Koinonia is the financial help that Paul receives from the Philippian congregation. He's going to mention this again several times in this letter, especially here at the end of chapter 1. This koinonia, this financial funding of Paul's mission from the Philippian side, gives him the freedom then to preach the gospel. Perhaps, now remember, when Paul says things like, I'm going to send Timothy to you, we just read, oh, he's going to send Timothy. We forget travel needs a budget. If you're going to send someone like Timothy with a letter to a congregation, you're going to have to pay for travel. You're going to have to pay for Timothy's lodging and food. You have to make sure he has enough to get back if you want him back. In other words, you need a budget. Now, we tend to think of Paul as a tent maker, like he makes tents and people buy them and they go camping. Hmm. Paul certainly was able to make a living. How profitable a living, I don't know. Could he support himself? Probably. Could he support his ministry? Probably not. Okay. Who buys tents in the ancient world, friends? Think about this. You're in the ancient world. Who's going to buy a tent? The military buy tents because they're nomadic. But is Paul sitting there sewing tents in Corinth, thinking, gosh, I think I'll go sell these to the nomads in Saudi Arabia? No, 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 no. So whether Paul has steady work or he doesn't have steady work, the fact is, without the help of a congregation like the Philippians, and there would be money there. There would be money there. Remember, we're dealing with a Roman colony. We're dealing with people that are connected to the Roman bureaucracy and probably the aristocracy. So we're dealing with the folks that have the ability to capitalize Paul's mission. Okay. As we go on, he says, I give thanks to my God every time I think about you, grateful for your participation with me in the gospel from the very first day I met you until the present. And he says, it is it is correct for me to think this way. That is, it's in line with that which is right for me to think this way. For the one who began a really good work in you will in fact perfect it on the day of Christ Jesus. One other note here for you, if you're reading this text, you'll notice in Philippians, Paul uses the word Christ Jesus, Christ Jesus, Jesus Christ. Only rarely does he use the singular Christ like he does in the other letters, a lot in the other letters. In Philippians, it's that full name and um, Jesus, the Messiah, the anointed. Okay, he says, it is right for me. I'm sorry, I think I skipped over. I did a homoteleotula. Okay. I'm sorry, verse 6 would read then, for I am persuaded of this, I'm assured of this, that the one who began a good work in you will perfect it at the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to think of you this way because you have me in your hearts. Paul understands the relationship he has with this community. They love him. They love him, and he loves them. This is not a community to which he has to make a defense of his apostleship. This is not a community where he's having to beg them to please come together in their factiousness. This is not a community he doesn't know, like Rome, where he has to present the interlocutor's false gospel alongside his true gospel. This is a congregation that he knows intimately. They're very dear to him and he to them. And he says, because I have you, for it is right for, I'm sorry, it is right for me to think all this about you because I have you in my heart. And I am sitting here reading stuff backwards today. It's like dyslexia of the brain. Okay. Both, now there are two parts here, and the little particle te is going to connect them, both in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. That is, it is right for me to have you in my heart, since both in the imprisonment, that is the fact that I'm confined in a cell, and that I'm having to defend and confirm the gospel. You've all become partners of God's grace with me in this. And this is for Paul the going to be the backbone of now everything he's going to say, this apologia, this defense and confirmation in the midst of being in bonds. He's worse than a doulos, my friends. This is worse. Now he's a prisoner for the Lord, not just a servant, but he's now a prisoner. The little word te there that's both in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel connects the two together. I'll give you a really good example of this. It comes from John chapter 2, where Jesus makes the whip of cords, and it says that he then went out and used it on the sheep and the goats, and there's a te there. That is, it's not, he uses the whip on the humans and then the sheep and the goats. The te connects the sheep and the goats together, both sheep and goats, not both humans and then sheep and goats. So the te is going to connect Paul's bonds with the defense and confirmation of the gospel. How does Paul being imprisoned created defense for the gospel? What is the gospel? What's the nature of the gospel? That Paul being in chains is a confirmation of its truth. Do you see this? Unless the confirmation of the truth is that Paul is innocent, and his gospel is about an innocent, suffering human being crucified by Romans and Jewish leadership alike and raised from the dead by God, not just for Israel, but also for the nations. So he goes on to say, God is my witness that I long for all of you. In the old translations have in the bowels of Christ Jesus. That just makes it sound like Paul's got a really bad case of gas. Um, for I long for you in the compassion of Jesus. His desire for them, he is arguing, comes out of the compassion Jesus has for them. This is what is his motivates his particular desire. And now he's going to come for what he prays for. What does he pray for these Philippians? We don't even know what kind of situation they're in yet. We haven't even gotten there. So it'll be interesting to see what's going on there in light of what he's going to ask for. Notice he begins in verse 9. This I pray, that your love may abound more and more in what? Knowledge. How does love abound in knowledge, my friends? Have you thought about this? I mean, are these just words? What your love abounds more and more in knowledge and every kind of insight. I mean, we read these texts without thinking about them. How does love abound in knowledge? Paul is saying that whatever it is they're going to know, okay, and even more so, whatever kind of insight they're going to have is going to be a love abounding insight, a love abounding knowledge. Love and knowledge, love and insight go together when it is love that produces the knowledge, or the knowledge love, and vice versa with insight and love. They belong together for the Apostle Paul, at least right now for this prayer. He prays that their love would abound more and more with every kind of knowledge and insight. And then the translation in the New English Bible is so that you can decide what is best. I don't like that at all. I do not like that. Because the verb dokimazo is used here. Dokimazo is a verb that we would frequently translate as to test, as to purify, purifying a metal. You've often heard preachers say dokimazo is used to purify gold. You test gold, and you purify it, you dokimazo it, and it gets rid of the dross. Okay, that's the verb that's used here. There's a testing going on. There's a distinguishing, there's a discerning of what? Of differences. That is, there are things that need to be distinguished. There There are things that are going to be good, and there are things that are going to be not good. There are things that are going to be healthy. There are things that are going to be not healthy. In fact, we come to chapter 4, Paul makes it very, very, very clear what are the exact things that he's wanting them to consider in this dokimazen, and he uses a set of virtues at that point. But he's not there yet, so we're not at the end of the letter. But he wants them to discern the differences. What their love should abound more and more, that they can discern the differences. The differences of what? He says, when you discern these differences, and your love about your knowledge abounds in love, and your love and knowledge abounds in insight. When this happens, he says, you'll be sincere and blameless. The sincerity, blameless thing is we're going to see these words pop up again throughout this letter and some synonyms as well. But to be blameless here, aproskopoi, has to do with not being a stumbling block, not causing someone to trip over you, not being what in Greek is called a skandalon, a scandal, or what Rene Girard would refer to as the model obstacle relationships. And so for me, this is a clear signal, and it's something that I picked up on that I realize helps define the relationship Paul sees with his opponents, the Philippians with their opponents, and also between persons in this congregation like Euodia and Synodike in chapter 4. So they are to learn to abound in love with knowledge and insight, so they can discern something, and that this would be done so that when this discernment occurred, they would be without blame. They would not be putting others in a rivalrous situation with them. So, for example, when I go to the Bauer Art Gingrich dictionary here, and I look up this particular word, um, I'm lost it. There it is. Um, there it is. Okay. Um, I just had it here. Give me 1 second. Uh, there it is. Okay. Here's how Bauer and Gingrich is going to give me as far as possibilities in the English language. Aproskopos, pertaining to being without fault because of not giving offense, that is, undamaged or blameless. Pertaining to not causing offense, giving no offense, no reason for stumbling. That is, whatever situation the Philippian Christians are in, they are to discern their situation in such a way that not only do they abound in love, but they do not become the cause of model obstacle relationships. We're going to see this thing over and over in this letter because Paul's going to talk about rivalries and factions. He's going to use Jesus as a model of humility in chapter 2 in the great hymn. This is going to be a theme of this letter. That is, there are apparently ways of dealing with opponents and empire that involve all kinds of negative things. And Paul says, no, 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 these are not going to be part of who you are and who we are as followers of Jesus. There's an entirely different path so that when the truth comes out, we're seen as the ones that did not start anything. It's kind of like uh, well, anyway, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. That's the whole purpose of Paul's petition, so that they, abounding in love and knowledge and insight, would be able to figure out the important differences, and in doing so, not become a scandal, a stumbling block, a model obstacle to those that they are in this negative relationship with. And this will be to their righteousness. So, beginning in verse 12, I want you to know, brothers and sisters. The Adelphoi here is not just, it's, yes, it's male, it's Greek, and there is a Greek word for sisters, Adelphi, but the translators now recognize Adelphoi as a more generic term. It's just like saying a man says, meaning any person says. It's generic here, but it would certainly include the women. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that my situation has actually turned out to advance the gospel. That is a military term, to advance the gospel. That is, it is Paul's situation that has made the gospel now become this marching army forward. There's an advance that's taking place into enemy territory because Paul is imprisoned on behalf of the gospel. And what is that advance? The advance, Paul says, is that the imperial guard. Now, um, uh, when Paul says in the Greek text, amongst the whole of the praetorium and all the rest, we have to distinguish between the guard that Paul is under there in Corinth, which may well have been the Praetorian Guard. Apparently it was, because Paul says it's Praetorian Guard. Now, Praetorian Guard is Caesar's personal army. And the vast bulk of the Praetorian Guard lives in Rome, dwells in Rome, protects Caesar. That's where that's the army of which the Caesar is the general. Okay, Rome has other armies and legions of which there are other generals, and if you've seen the Gladiator movies, you realize troops can be loyal to their general, and that's often how a Caesar became Caesar, was they had a massive army and the troops were loyal to that particular general, and that general would become a Caesar until the second century when it becomes part of this family thing. But here, Paul is saying that the Praetoria, the governor's palace, wherever he's at, let's assume it's Corinth, the governor's palace, it's the guard of that palace that he is under lock and key with. This is not your average jail. This is not your county hangup. This is, your max 5 secure facility kind of thing. I'm trying to give you a feel for what it means for Paul to have the Praetorian Guard watching him rather than just jailers, okay? But the Praetorian Guard's important because they are connected to the household and the dynamics of the power politics in Rome. So here's Paul. He's become a prisoner. It is the Praetorian Guard that take him in. So guess who he gets to talk to? He gets to talk to them. The elite guard, the elite prison keepers. They are the elite. And now he makes friends with them. It may well be, at least it appears to be, that some of them actually get converted. And we know later that there are those in Caesar's household that were converts. Okay, not the whole household, but some. And that's later down the road, not at this time. So here's Paul saying that the Praetorian Guard, they know why I'm here. In other words, they would understand that whatever charge Paul is brought up on is brought up because he has been preaching about this Jesus who died, rose again, ascended into the heavens, and will return. That's the Jesus that Paul is preaching. And he says, as a result of this awareness that Paul has the ear of the elites by having the ear of the Praetorian Guard. Guess who doesn't have that ear? The James Peter group, the zealots from Jerusalem. They don't have that ear, right? No, of course not. They don't want that ear. But here Paul is now getting deeper and deeper, worming his way in the gospel's way into the household of Caesar. And in verse 14, he says, most of the brothers and sisters have confidence in the Lord because of my imprisonment. They see me, they see how I'm handling this, they see that the word is getting out to the higher ups, right? You with me on this? I'm not going to draw any modern parallels, although I would love to, but I'm hoping your brain is taking you there. Okay? Most of the brothers and sisters have confidence in the Lord because of my imprisonment. They see what it's leading to. They can see the implications of the people that I'm now talking to and talking with. And he says, and more than ever, they dare to speak the word or the message of the gospel fearlessly. Now, we finally come to the first mention of the opponents. Who are we dealing with here? Why has Paul prayed for this congregation with their overseers and deacons? And then we're talking multiple house churches here in Philippi. Why has he prayed for this congregation to have love in their knowledge and insight, and so that they're not stumbling blocks? He says, some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from eris and rivalry. Thonon and rivalry, eris and thonon. I want to take you on a little journey here. We're going to do a word study together with you. I'm hoping that it doesn't take the rest of the time, but I'm going to take as long as it takes here because I want you to see what a word can do to bring context to something. So we come to this. Let's read verse 15, 16, 17, and 18. It's a little paragraph. Okay. Some tennis, to be sure. That's your men, Tommy. Tennis men on the one hand. And then in verse 16, you notice that you have the hoi men repeated there. Okay. Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Two groups, two types of people talking Jesus the Messiah. The latter, that is, those who do it from goodwill, do so from love because they know I am placed here for the defense of the gospel. Let's keep reading. We're gonna come back and exegete this. The former proclaim Christ from Erythea, not sincerely, because they think they can cause me trouble in my imprisonment. So, stop. You have one group preaches Christ out of love, and they do it because they know that Paul was placed in the prison for the defense of the gospel. If Paul hadn't gotten placed in prison there, he wouldn't be able to give a formal defense, an apologia, like we see in the book of Acts several times where Paul is brought before the authorities and he is going to give his apology, his defense. Okay, now he's giving a defense of this gospel of the crucified God, and he's doing it before these authorities, these principalities and powers, and it's getting him airtime with some very important people. And then there are those who don't have access to those ears, and they are jealous and they are envious. And so the one group knows that Paul is suffering. And so when they say Paul is in prison, they mean one thing. When the other group that does it out of rivalry and envy, when they say Paul is in prison, they're trying to use that as something negative against him. Okay? They're trying to say it's bad for Paul to be in prison. He must have done something wrong. Now, let's come back and let's look at this. Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from thonos and eris. Now, this word eris, we're just going to take a little look at it. So, how do you do a word study? So, this is for you folks that want to know how to do a word study. And I'm going to go on a limb here and I'm going to say if you have the Logos software or a good Bible software, if you have a good one, you can do this kind of work. I'm going to give you the actual names of the books or the that I'm using for this, but again, that software is going to be good enough for you if you don't read a Greek New Testament. And so you'll want to do this, and this is how you do a word study. Just don't anybody tell Francois Dutoit. Okay, this is how you do a word study. So I'm reading this text and I come across the word eris. It's my mind is kind of foggy, thinking I don't recognize that word. Well, there's a reason I don't recognize it. Number one, it's not used that often in the New Testament, a little more than half a dozen times. So, of course, I'm not going to be familiar with it necessarily. Um, Second, it's only used in Paul's letters. So it's a Pauline term. Ah, so now I'm dealing with specific Pauline vocabulary. So here's what I do. I take my Greek New Testament concordance, okay, and I look up this word eris. I've got it twice in Romans, twice in First Corinthians, once in Second Corinthians, once in Galatians, right here in Philippians, and then twice in the pastorals. So we'll leave the pastorals out of it because they're not Paul for our purposes. And so we've got 7 uses of the word eris. Oh, fascinating. So now we get to play. This is what you do to do a word study before you look it up, before you go to the lexicon to let the translators tell you what kind of language they're going to use. You go look up the other times it's used. Okay, so let's go to Romans 1:29. Well, when we go to Romans 1:29, we're going to find that word used, but what's the context? Oh my goodness. Romans 1:29 is a list of vices. Well, let's look at this list, okay? He's just been talking about the Gentiles, and of course we know this to be the uh, uh, the interlocutor, James, Peter, somebody from Jerusalem that's preaching this gospel about the apocalypse of God from heaven and this, that, and the other, and so this all comes out of that standard Jewish, anti-Jewish rhetoric like you find in the Wisdom of Solomon. So go read the Wisdom of Solomon sometime, and then go read Romans 1. And sometime around chapter 7, 8, or 9 of the Wisdom of Solomon, you're going to find most of Romans 1. Okay? Here's what Paul says. They are filled with every kind of unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, malice. They are rife or full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, hostility. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, contrivers of all sorts of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, covenant breakers. That's interesting that that's in there because you have to be Jewish to be a covenant breaker. Heartless, ruthless. What when you hear a vice list like that, my friends, right? It's not the kind of vice list you're getting today from the Christian pulpits, is it? Is it? At all. This is a vice list that has to do with relationships between people. The whole thing. The whole thing has to do, this whole passage has to do with the breakdown of relationships. And here are the things that cause this breakdown in relationships. And so in verse 29, you have the typical Old Testament Septuagint bringing together of these four nouns that are used here in verse 29. Unrighteousness, um, porneia is the term that's used here, wickedness, covetousness, and malice. These are brought together, and in particular, when you go to the Jewish scriptures, you will find porneia is most often used in conjunction with idolatry. To commit idolatry is to commit a form of porneia in the theological realm. Okay, there's a close connection between what some you could easily say is immorality and idolatry. Okay, idolatry is the issue. Okay, you'll notice here in the Romans passage, at any rate, where he doesn't lump groups of types of people. He's talking about behaviors and attitudes and orientations, and he continues on that they're rife with every kind of evil, and including Thonu. Notice Thonu is there, Phonu, and Eridos or Eris in the dative, and these three, envy, or translated here as strife, deceit, hostility, um, deceit, fighting, and factionalism, some sort of eridos, some sort of breakaway. Something's happening here that's creating splits in relationships. Well, let's look at another passage. Let's go to Romans 13:13. And later in the letter, Paul's going to use the same term again. How does he use it there? What's it in conjunction with? What's going on with this term? What does it mean? So Romans 13:13 reads, let us live in the daytime, not in carousing or in drunkenness, not in immorality and sensuality, not in, here we go, this translation reads, not in discord and jealousy. The two words are eris and zelo. Eris, whatever eris is, and zeal. Zeal. Zeal is a problem that's connected with eris in this text. When we go to 1 Corinthians 3:3, if you'll just flip over to 1 Corinthians 3:3, we're going to find the exact same thing. He says, for since there is still, in this translation, it reads jealousy and dissension. But in the Greek text, there are zeal and eris, zelos and eris. Zeal, the problem of zeal, the willingness to kill in the name of God, and eris, whatever eris is, belong together. They belong together. So when we are going to come to translate eris, it has to do, on the one hand, in its connection with thonos, envy, it has to do with envy, because it's connected in these other texts with envy, but it's also connected here with zeal. We find the exact same thing in 2 Corinthians 12:20. So if you go to 2 Corinthians 12:20, this is what you're going to get. Well, that's 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, my bad. 2 Corinthians 12:20. I am afraid that somehow when I come, I will not find you as I wish, and you will not find me as you wish. I'm afraid that somehow there may be, and then we've got this list of words, and it starts off with eris, zelos, and thumos. Eris, some sort of something. Zealous, zeal, factionalism, that one side just hates the other with the passion, and thumoi, rage, rage. Okay, this is what Paul's afraid of. He's going to see in this congregation some kind of factionalism based on zeal, that one is doing the will of God by hating the other side with rage. And he goes on to use other terms here: selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder. Okay? But the point is in this text, thumoi, zelos, and eris are again there together. We can find now when we come to our Galatians 5:20, it's going to be the exact same thing in Galatians 5:20. We've got a list of behaviors that Paul calls works of the flesh: immorality, impurity, depravity, idolatry. And then in the next list come sorceries, hostilities, hatreds, eris, zelos, thumos, in that order, same order as we found in the Corinthian letters. They belong together. These selfish rivalries, these dissensions, and these factions. And then Paul goes on to name a few other things: envying, murder, my friends, murder. He's mentioning murder. Why? Because that's what zeal leads to. Okay. So that's that. Now, when we come back to the Philippians text, so come back with me to Philippians chapter 1. You have Paul saying, some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from thonos, envy, and eris. When I go to my trusty Bauer and Gingrich, which is the handy dandy scholarly lexicon of choice for all the scholars out there, and I look up eris, this is what I see. First, it's a word that is predominantly in the New Testament, but it's found in some other places in classical Greek. It means engagement in rivalry. Now, we've already seen Paul use the word aproskopos, which means to not be in rivalry, to not be in a model obstacle relationship, to not cause someone to stumble over you. Here, eris is to engage in rivalry. And then the lexicon notes, especially with reference to positions taken in a matter: strife, discord, contention. In other words, somebody's taken a position on a particular issue somewhere, and they are doing it with such zeal that they are doing great damage in whatever it is they're saying about the other party in Philippi or the Philippians themselves. Somebody in the Christian community is doing great damage, even though they're preaching the Christ the Messiah, they're doing damage to the Philippians. This is eris. Now, what there is another form of eris, eritheia, which is going to get used here as well. We notice it says, the former proclaimed Christ from eritheia. Is eris in verse 15 related to eritheia in verse 17? Did one derive from the other? There is some debates in and around this, but here's the interesting part. Listen to what eritheia means. Again, my translation has the former proclaimed Christ from selfish ambition. But here is eritheia in the Bauer, Art, and Gingrich lexicon. It's found in the New Testament before the New Testament is written. It's only found in Aristotle. Okay, it's only found in Aristotle, his Politics. So it's a political word. It denotes a self-seeking pursuit of political office by unfair means. Its meaning in our literature is a matter of conjecture. It's a derivation from eris, but not necessarily regarded with favor by New Testament linguistic authorship, and some consider it unlikely. Then they show the list of vices I just gave you, because in those list of vices, Eris is used, and erytheia is also used in those list of vices, where it is often translated as strife, dispute, contentiousness. But here now we get to have a little more fun. Back at the turn of the century, a couple of the 20th century, the early 1900s, um, the papyri were being discovered. And so up to that time, when people were looking at the Greek Septuagint, they thought it was some kind of holy language, or that the Caini of the New Testament was a holy language. But then the papyri came out with, said, oh God, these words are used everywhere. That's why it's called Caini, common. This is common vocabulary. This is regular stuff. We can find these words, in letters from mom to the principal about why Johnny's sick, or a doctor's note, or an investment contract, or something. But here's Erythea in the papyri. So think about this. The original meaning, work for hire, as in the Septuagint, can be illustrated from various papyri with regard to weavers of wool, fellow workers. Okay? It later comes to mean party spirit. Well, how do you get party spirit or factionalism or anything else like that out of something that had to do with with laborers? I'm not sure, except to say that there's either that notion of looking down on the laborer, that is, the elite looking down on the laborer, thus creating that sense of entitlement that Paul's arguing against, or there's no connection at all. Either way, in both cases, Eris and Erythea, we have to do with someone that is promoting a position with rage, thumoi, and zeal, zealousness, to the detriment of the community. That's what they're doing. And they think in doing so, they're hurting Paul. But Paul says, no, this imprisonment that I'm in, it has everything to do with the gospel. And so that is, the imprisonment itself has become now part of the gospel message. And here in verse 18, he says, the former proclaim Christ from selfish ambition. They think they can cause me trouble. What's the result? What's all this mean for me? Paul says, only that in every way, whether in falseness or truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. For Paul, now listen, this is really important. For Paul, you have this proclamation of the Messiah that's being done, and something is being said about this Jesus that is going to hurt Paul. It's supposed to hurt Paul because he's in prison. Paul is saying, or he's certainly going to say in a moment here, and we won't have time to get to that today, but next week we will. Paul is going to be arguing here that in fact what has occurred to him is an imitation or a model of the passion, and that this is the Christian life. This is where great joy comes. So when we think about how did Paul handle suffering? How did Paul handle being imprisoned, being in chains? How did the Philippian community handle the harassment that is coming at them? And if you continue reading this letter, just reading this letter, you'll see it. How did they handle it? And how did they do it with joy? And how did they do it without engaging the other and creating mimetic model obstacle relationships? It seems to me this letter already has a lot to say to the modern American church. That is, how do we rightfully protest what we perceive to be the prison of empire, the perhaps the dictatorial character of empire. And it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, you always got the other in office, so everybody at some point is going to feel persecuted, you know. All the Republican Christians felt persecuted under Biden, and now all the liberal progressive Christians feel persecuted under Trump. It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to perceive yourself that way. But is the way they're handling it, with the shots at each other, with the sniping, with the hate? In fact, we even have Christians coming out right now, and I've put this on my Facebook page, and arguing for violence, the use of physical killing, death-oriented violence to certain figures in the administration right now. And this from pulpits. I've put the actual videos online, and I just read another example today on X. My friends, this ought not to be. This is not the way so-called Christians express their faith. And right now, the entire world is watching as Christians make utter fools of themselves with this level of hate, this level of hateful rhetoric, this level of labeling, this level of denying the other. The whole thing that's going on between the right and the left in American Protestant Christianity is this setup here in Philippians. It is a mimetic stumbling block. Both sides are stumbling over the other. Both sides are expressing themselves with eris, thumos, zelos. Paul says these are not the behaviors that we engage in when we're oppressed. When we're oppressed is a different mindset. And for Paul, that part of that mindset is understanding that the bondage may be given by the state, but Jesus is still going to be the Lord, the Caesar, at the end of chapter 2, where he says, every tongue will confess Jesus is Kurios. Jesus is Caesar. He holds the keys to all of our handcuffs. He holds the keys to all of our prison doors, not the state. Well, I can't carry on because I can't finish chapter 1 today, so I'll have to finish chapter 1 next week. So any conversations you want to have? Was it that bad?
I have a question, Michael. So back in verse 9, he's talking about love abounding in knowledge and discernment. Can you kind of simplify or paraphrase, or what are they talking about? Knowledge and discernment of motives, teachings, everything
So,
for them anyway.
okay, epignosko, from gnosko, to know. Epignosko is uh, it has that character of having learned through life experience, that you may learn through the knowledge that life brings, and each or every insight that you have about life. Paul's saying, may this insight you have, and may this life lesson learning that you participate in, may it help you abound more and more in love. In other words, the purpose of learning life lessons and the purpose of insight, whether it's human or divine, doesn't matter here, is to cause the agape in us to grow. So it's that simple. What does life teach you? If life teaches you, to be bitter and angry and resentful and chaotic and hateful and this and that and the other, that's not abounding in love, and thus that's not the gospel. It's not living in this cross-filled cruciform life. I mean, we talk a lot, Bruce, about cruciform life, cruciform existence. We talk about discipleship and carrying the cross, but what we none of us here, as far as I know, have ever been put in prison because of something related to the gospel, right?
Mhm.
As far as I know. So, but we can feel imprisoned, and then it's how we handle that that becomes really important. And that's why I think Paul begins the letter right off the bat, douloi, servants. I'm an apostle, they should listen to me. I saw Jesus, what the hell's their problem? Blah 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 blah. No, he doesn't assume that position. He takes the position he's in handcuffs, and he says, "This is the glory of God. This is the glory of God. Look at me. I'm in handcuffs. It's the glory of God." Just as he could look at the cross, and the Johannine author especially could look at the crucified and refer to that as the doxa theou, the glory of God. We've got to get our heads wrapped around this, because I think our tendency is to want to gain intellectual knowledge. If the intellectual knowledge I give you just makes you feel superior, then I'm doing the wrong thing as a teacher. But if the knowledge I'm giving you helps you grow in wisdom and understanding and compassion and mercy and generosity and all these other things, then that's epignosis, and insight that you have that abounds in love, and thus it's the gospel. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered your
Yep,
question.
yes, it does. Yep.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be any questions coming at the moment, so I'll chip in. As Michael probably knows, I think from Facebook, I've been reading Etty Hillesum, and some of the things that she says seem to tie into this very closely
Oh, how fun!
because she was somebody who was martyred by the Nazis in Auschwitz.
Hmm.
So her experience is very much one of prison and suffering. Oh, and one of the themes that seems to be in there in the mix is the value of redemptive suffering.
Hmm.
And one of her big ideas was that, well, it's a refusal to hate,
Hmm.
even the Nazis,
Yeah.
or particularly the Nazis, because she had there was a quote I was looking at this morning. Just bring it up. It's been brought home to me, forcibly to me, how every atom of hatred added to the world makes it an even more inhospitable place. And that just, for me, that just feels very crucial.
Hmm.
She's,
Yeah.
it's you're not ignoring the reality, you're facing it head on,
Hmm.
but you're refusing to allow it to influence you.
Hmm.
And you're bringing something else into life that is positive and real.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike, what's the name of the person you're studying, Mike? I missed that.
It's Etty, Etty,
Mhm.
Hillesum. Um, she was the Dutch Jew.
What's the last, how do you spell the last name?
Hillesum.
Thank you. Yeah.
She wrote a diary,
Wow.
and then the letters from the transit camp at Westerbork, where every Monday or Tuesday there would be a train going out with 1,000 Jews onto Auschwitz. So, she's looking at the evil
Hmm.
full in the face, but yeah,
It's stunning. It's stunning.
evil things are done by people that I would not call evil.
Yeah.
I think the most negative thing you can say about a lot of the people that did all this was that they were just so ordinary. They were boring.
That was Hannah Arendt's thesis, right?
Yeah,
Evil is banal.
Mhm. Mhm.
We want to make it out to be the exorcist, and it's really the bureaucrat.
yeah. And there's a couple of times where she's looking at some of the prison guards, and what she's feeling for them is compassion.
Hmm. Wow.
Very powerful.
Sounds like a book we should be reading.
I was reminded of that section in Girard's Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, Michael. You know it, toward the end, love and knowledge, right? Where, he's trying to bring everything together and argue that, you know, reading the cross anthropologically is the only true, the only way to really get accurate knowledge of how human beings function, right? So
Right.
there's Girard is being faithful to the scriptures with that proposition, I guess.
Right.
Not to be clever or paradoxical. I mean, I'm totally in sympathy with what you're saying, but here's a but. I don't even want the but to be a but it's a
I like a big butt, and I cannot.
there's a small but um, how can I put it? I guess one point of uh, murmur of uneasiness I have is um, so take any really fraught ethical question where two uh, positions cannot be reconciled, say the abortion debate, or, to take an issue that is pretty divisive in Christian communities, the acceptance of non-heterosexual relationships and people, right? Um, uh, um, and I can understand the call not those who disagree with you on an ethical question. But, hypothetically, I can imagine, two camps of people who are very gentle with each other. Like I can imagine two groups of people getting together and talking very kindly, um, but still leaving with completely opposing points of view that are going to result in different policies, different communities, uh, different structures of risk for acceptance. Like I attend a very, very liberal church, and I like to point out the irony to people that, we pride ourselves on being super tolerant, but we're not tolerant of the what we would think of as the intolerant,
That's right.
I mean,
That's
we
right.
exclude the intolerant.
That's right.
So I guess uh my question would be, is there any law at all, left when one is working under the umbrella of love and nonviolent love? Is there anything like law left? How
Are
would
we
you
talking in
respond to that
are
question?
we talking in the Christian community being led by the Spirit, or are we talking human society?
Well, I mean, it would be the same question to the extent that our goal would be to welcome as many people in human society into the Christian community. But to
Okay,
keep things
but
simple, I could say in the Christian
okay,
community.
in the Christian community, there is no law. There
Mhm,
can never be a law.
mhm,
Love dissolves law.
mhm, mhm,
Love doesn't need law there in order to love the other, to care for the other, right?
mhm,
So love could in its own head be pro-life and still care for the woman that chose to undergo an abortion. Still care, right? I've been in that position. I'm pro-life, but I cared for somebody that chose an abortion, not my baby, but okay. Um, I just felt it was the right thing to do, you know. And it wasn't a case of love the sinner, hate the sin. It was just a case of just loving the person that had to make this very hard choice to begin with, and then we had to go through it, and then had to deal with the consequences of it, in their own head, and to walk with them as a pastor in a sense through that process. Um, I don't see our so-called Christian brothers and sisters in this country, Andrew, having any interest at all in listening to each other. They are both they've come out and said they're tired of listening to each other, and they refuse to hear each other. And they're all demanding a voice. I'm later on in this letter, when we get to the Christological, I'm going to talk about how Paul views the question of rights and our rights. Because if you look at the rhetoric out there right now, both sides are claiming that they have the gospel, they alone have the gospel, and the other is non-Christian. I mean, that's how they're rhetorically addressing each other, and thus both sides, by declaring the other side not to be a Christian, feel as though they have the right now to attack on every level. And I find that pathetic. I find it absolutely pathetic that nobody's listening. Everybody has something that's important to say. I mean, but again, what concern of it is it? Like, for example, let's take Doge and what Elon is doing with the government. What concern of that is it to the church? Even a church that's getting money from the government for programs. What concern is it what the government does? And if that money dries up, the church shouldn't dry up. Church benefactorship should rise. But we're not teaching that. We don't teach that in the church. No, instead we go suck on the government's tit more and more and more. And then when things get shut down, we get angry and upset and on and on.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I fail to see what most of what goes on in society has to do with the church. Because the church is not a social work institution. It never was. You go back in the first century, you don't find the early Christians, you don't find the Philippians out there in front of the jail, free Paul, we want Paul free, you don't find that. You don't find any nonsense like that. I mean, I don't know why people think today it's going to make any difference. I just don't.
So my kingdom is not of this world isn't just referring to the reality of the soul, the promise of another level of reality around us now and
No, Paul's gonna
after us.
say,
It's referring to the fact that the church itself needs to disengage from its quest for political power. That's part of what you're suggesting.
yeah. I mean, what does Paul say in this very letter? Our politeuma, our citizenship is in heaven. Yours and mine, is not American and Canadian. There's not a flag that divides us or a land border that divides us. We are brothers in the same realm as Jesus and everybody else here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, the political church, as it is nowadays, the church is completely politicized. Is going to go the way of the politicized church of the 3rd century the 8th century, the 16th century, the early 20th century. When you politicize the church, when you turn the church into society, which is what liberalism is, liberalism, the liberal Christians, progressive Christianity in America, is a form of Constantinian Christianity. It wants to change American society into its vision of what it means to be Christian by the passing of laws, legislative agendas. And if we can get those passed, then everybody has to follow those laws. So they're using law to bring in what they perceive to be gospel, and it cannot be done. It's been tried and found wanting for 1700 years. You cannot take the human species and put makeup on it like on a pig and say, look, aren't we beautiful? We are a mess. We're a hot mess. After what, 7,000 years of civilization, what can we say about ourselves? We have the ability to blow ourselves up. Wonderful. Wonderful. Great. After 7,000 years of evolution, we can destroy the planet with the push of a button. That's marvelous. That's amazing to me. If I was God, I'd be going, wow, I made these people. This is so cool. No, I'm being an idiot. As Paul says, I speak as a human. No, I'm beginning to see in this letter each day as I read through it, and Cheryl's been very kind to me. She lets me sit and reflect out loud ideas and things, but I'm beginning to put myself in Paul's shoes. I'm asking, what's it like to be in that prison? What's it like to have those out there that don't like me for various reasons criticizing me? And I know they're doing it. I know other people are hearing. What's it like when I have to write letters to other congregations because they're having to deal with all this same stuff too? What's it like for me? And then have them write this letter to the Philippians, and it's like, oh, you guys are the ones that brighten up my day. I know you love me. I know you care about me. Let's just talk about this. And he does. And it's beautiful. I'm just becoming more and more astonished as I read this letter at his ability to live this existence that he's living with such joy and intense gratitude for his brothers and sisters. And for their support of him, their willingness to support him when he's not worthy of support, man. He's a prisoner, you know. He's a Steve Bannon in prison, I don't mean, I'm just trying to think of somebody in prison, a Charles. I don't want to say Charles Manson, but he's in prison.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he wouldn't be there unless he was bad, you know. So yeah, and here Paul's going, no, 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 no. This is how the gospel works. This is the glory of God right here, right here. I perhaps shouldn't do this, but my mind tends to want to wander back perhaps to a Dr. King in a Birmingham jail. You know, he's not writing the letter to the Philippians because he's still irate against the whites, but at any rate,
Nelson Mandela, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Nelson Mandela, yeah, Bonhoeffer, yeah. Doug Campbell has a thesis that you cannot understand Paul unless you've been to prison.
Hmm.
You know, and that's why he does prison ministry. He goes in and teaches Paul in prisons. Yeah, I think that's pretty cool.
Well, the interesting thing is, I mean, to not be political today is
damn near
you're
impossible.
considered irresponsible,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
If you don't take political positions,
Correct.
if you don't, if you're not willing to engage in political arguments, if you're not
Right.
quote unquote following the news.
Right.
And I find it endlessly frustrating because I do, and not to pat myself on the back, but I do try to listen to podcasts and commentators from both the left and the right. And it
Mhm.
just makes my brain hurt because, I mean, you get, it's just like what's true, like what's empirically, factually true. And do I have the time to investigate and
Right,
find out what's
right,
empirically, objectively true? I don't,
right.
you know. And then, so I just want to, work on my prayers and my Bible study and my reading or whatever,
Yeah.
writing to my family or whatever, doing my own. And then I feel, well, that's not enough. You should really find out what's true so you can get mad at the right people and, knock out people in arguments at dinner parties, and then you be a responsible citizen, and so maybe Philippians is going to let me let go of all that if I can.
Amen. Hey,
Yeah.
I've got 2:30, and so it would normally be time for us to close, but if anybody has a burning question, I'm happy we can entertain that.
We do meet again next week. Is that
We do
correct?
meet again next week. Now, on March 1st, I have the seminar.
The other one, yeah.
Hope you'll all be there, and that'll be fun. Um, I'm trying to create really fun seminars, for people, and I hope they're beneficial.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
they're certainly good. They're stimulating for me because I'm doing a lot of reading and, to prep for a lot of this. So my brain has been on fire for a couple of months. I had a great sabbatical, getting ready for this, and yeah, just kind of re-engaged myself again, got back into reading a Greek text like I hadn't done since I talked with you, Tommy. We were doing it together. It's been a while. And so it was good for me just to walk around with it and, yeah, play again. It was good. All right, gang, I will stop the recording here and